Every hydrologist who drove out to Sage Creek Road in Harney County, Oregon in the spring of 2019 looked at the same thing. They saw a dying draw, a cracked stream, a quarter-mile of willows gone brown and brittle from the roots up. They all walked the same ground. They all reached the same conclusion. And they were all wrong about what was going to fix it. Dale Mercer was one of them. He worked for the county's Soil and Water Conservation District and had been doing that work for 22 years, which is long enough to get comfortable with your own certainty. He told Nora Voss what he'd told 2 other ranchers that spring, that what she had was a degraded riparian corridor with insufficient base flow, and that the fix involved gravel placement and some brush weaving and probably a few years of reduced grazing pressure. He said it would cost around $14,000 to get started, and that there were cost-share programs she could apply to. He was polite. He shook her hand at the truck. He did not stay for the question she asked after he turned to leave. The question was about beavers. He answered it over his shoulder. He said beavers were a state matter, and that reintroduction was complicated, and that, honestly, it wasn't really the direction she needed to go. She thanked him and watched his pickup disappear around the bend where the old Ingram property started. Then she went inside and called a woman named Maggie Holt at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife in Bend, because Nora Voss had already done 4 months of reading before she invited Dale Mercer out. She already knew what she was going to do. Stories like this don't get told much anymore. Somebody had to write this one down or it would have been forgotten. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. Harney County is the largest county by land area in Oregon and one of the least populated in the lower 48 states. It is high desert, cold in winter and dry the rest of the year, and what water there is moves through it in thin threads. Creek draws and seasonal channels that fill up in snowmelt and shrink back to nothing by August. The Voss place sat on 1,840 acres east of Burns, with Sage Creek running through the north pasture for about 1.5 miles before it disappeared into a culvert and crossed under the county road. In a wet year, that creek ran knee-deep in April. By 2018, it was barely ankle-deep in March, and gone by late May, 3 weeks earlier than her father remembered. The grass along the banks had retreated. The willows were dying. The stock tank at the north end of the property, the one her father had fed off the creek with a 1/2-inch line, had gone dry 2 summers running. She'd been hauling water in a 500-gallon tank on the back of a Ford F-350 since July of 2018, hitched to the same John Deere gooseneck she'd inherited along with the property, which cost her roughly $180 a week in fuel and time. Not sustainable, just slow bleeding. Her neighbors were sympathetic. Bud Hensley at the co-op told her the whole county was drying out, and that it wasn't just her. A man named Walt Tibbs, who ran a cow-calf operation on the old Ingram place, told her in September of 2019 that he'd talked to a state rep about it and wasn't optimistic. Walt was not a pessimistic man by nature, which made the comment land harder than it might have otherwise. Nora was 34 at the time. She'd come back to the property in 2016 after her father's death, intending to stay through the estate settlement and then return to her job in Bend doing GIS mapping work for a land trust. She did not return to Bend. The ranch got hold of her the way ranches do with some people. Quietly, without argument. She'd inherited more than the deed. Jerry Voss, her father, had kept a filing cabinet in the shop with 40 years of rain gauge records, soil notes, and photocopied articles torn from grazing magazines and university extension pamphlets. He had a manila folder labeled, in his handwriting, Beaver Hydrology, Wet Creek. It contained 7 articles, 2 of them from the 1980s, and one printed off a university extension website with a date of 1997 in the corner. He had underlined things in the articles. He had written in the margins. One margin note said, "This is what we need, but nobody will listen." Her father had read about beaver reintroduction. He'd written to the state in 2003 and gotten a form letter back. He'd written again in 2009 and gotten a longer reply that said the program wasn't operating in their district at that time. He had kept both letters in the folder. She found the folder the winter after his death, in January of 2017, when she was trying to inventory the shop. She read all 7 articles that evening at the kitchen table. She didn't do anything about it for 2 years. There was too much else. But she thought about it. She went back to the folder more than once. She started adding to it, printed things off. Read a study out of Colorado on low-tech process-based restoration. Read a paper on how beaver dams raise the water table, not just in the stream channel, but in the surrounding meadow soil, sometimes 200 feet to either side of the channel, and deeper than any pipe or gravel placement project ever goes. Read a case study from a ranch in Nevada where a degraded creek grew willows and sedge within 18 months of beavers being introduced, on ground that hadn't carried a functioning stream bank in over a decade. The underlying logic is not complicated once you sit with it. A beaver dam is not just a pile of sticks. It is a water storage structure that adjusts itself. When water levels rise, the dam leaks at a rate that roughly matches the inflow. When water levels drop, the dam holds back what it can. The effect on the surrounding meadow soil is called hyperheic recharge, groundwater that moves laterally into the land on both sides rather than running off downstream. A stream without beavers is a pipe. A stream with beavers is more like a sponge. The water doesn't leave, it spreads, and it sinks. And it comes back up in July and August when everything else has gone dry, seeping up through the soil and feeding grasses and willows and the root systems that hold the stream bank together. Jerry Voss had understood this in broad terms from what he'd read. He'd just never gotten anyone to listen. His daughter was better at getting people to listen, and she was also more stubborn about it than most people realized when they first met her. Maggie Holt at OTFW had been working on beaver translocation in Central Oregon for 6 years by then. When Nora called her in October of 2019, Maggie had a list of ranchers who'd applied for the program, and a shorter list of ranchers she actually wanted to work with, which she described as people who had done the reading and knew what they were agreeing to. She asked Nora 3 or 4 questions. She paused a moment after the beaver dam answer. Then she said she'd come out and look at the site. She visited the property in November and walked the creek with Nora for just over 3 hours. She took soil samples at 5 points along the channel. She checked the slope and substrate at 2 potential dam sites and measured the bankful channel width at a bend near the old fence crossing. She said the site was a reasonable candidate. She said she'd put in the application for the spring cohort and see what the allocation looked like. Then she said one more thing, standing at the tailgate of her state truck. She said, "A lot of the ranchers I work with, it takes them 2 meetings and a site visit and a referral from the Watershed Council before they really commit. You got there by reading articles in your dad's filing cabinet. That's not nothing." Nora said she appreciated it. Maggie drove out and the property was quiet again. Word got around, the way it does in a place like Harney County where the roads are long and people have time to talk. Walt Tibbs heard about it from his wife, who'd heard it from the woman at the feed store who'd heard Nora mention it while picking up a mineral block in early December. Walt came by, not unkindly, and said he'd heard she was going the beaver route. He said his brother-in-law had tried something similar on a place near Sylvie's, and it had made a mess of the irrigation headgate. He didn't tell her to stop. He just said he hoped it worked, which in that part of Oregon is a thing people say when they think you're making a mistake but don't want to argue about it. 2 other ranchers called that same month. One just asked questions, neutral and careful, the kind of questions a person asks when they're not sure whether to be skeptical or interested. The other laughed, not meanly, just with the particular amusement that comes when someone tries something that sounds impractical. He said he'd been battling beavers on his lower pasture for 15 years, and that inviting them in was the last thing he'd ever do. He said they flooded his wheel lines 2 winters in a row. Said he'd lost almost $3,000 in equipment damage the second year. She didn't argue with him. He wasn't wrong about what beavers could do on the wrong site in the wrong place. She thanked him and kept going. 3 beavers arrived on the Voss property on the 14th of April 2020. A pair, female and male, both adult, and a juvenile male. All 3 captured from a nuisance site near Klamath Falls, where they'd been flooding a county road. Maggie Holt supervised the release with a wildlife technician named Ryan, who didn't say much. They placed them at a bend in the creek, where Nora had already put in 3 small check dams made of T-posts and hardware cloth. Low-tech, inexpensive. Each one taking her about 2 hours to build. All 3 designed after she'd watched approximately 14 hours of instructional video from a restoration nonprofit based out of Bozeman. The check dams were not meant to be permanent. They were meant to slow the water down just enough to give the beavers a reason to stay. The female built her first dam within 72 hours of release. It was small, maybe 14 inches high and 6 feet across. Rough and loose in the way that a first dam always is. Ryan came back out 9 days later to check on it and said the placement was good. He said it was a good sign that she'd started working this fast. He said some pairs take 3 or 4 weeks before they commit to a location. He said it like he'd seen it go the other way plenty of times and was relieved it hadn't. Nora had been checking the creek every morning. She'd watched the female work at 4 in the morning with a headlamp, crouched in the grass 40 yards back so she wouldn't spook her. She watched the way the animal selected material, not random, not frantic, methodical in a way she hadn't expected. There is something in watching a wild thing work that is hard to put into words without it sounding like more than it is. It was early April and still cold, and the creek was running a decent flow for that time of year, and the female was working steady and quiet in the dark. Nora stayed out there longer than she'd planned. By early June, the dam was 30 inches high and had been reinforced twice. Water was backing up behind it in a pool roughly 40 feet long and holding 1.5 feet of depth at the deepest point. The male had begun a second structure about 120 feet upstream, smaller, built across a narrow section where the channel bent slightly east. The juvenile was doing what juvenile beavers apparently do, which is eat and sleep and occasionally dismantle whatever the adults have just finished, and she looked it up to confirm this was normal behavior, and it was. Nora started keeping notes. Not formal records, just a spiral notebook she kept on the kitchen counter, with the date and the pool length and any change she noticed. She sketched the dam locations. She noted the first day she saw sedge growing back at the pool margin, which was the 12th of June. She noted the first day she found wet soil spreading outward from the bank, which was the 3rd of July. She noted the water table reading she took with a hand auger at the 80-foot mark from the channel, which was 18 inches in August of 2019 and 11 inches in August of 2020. 7 inches closer to the surface. Not dramatic. Not nothing either. The pool behind the first dam held water through July. That had not happened on that stretch of creek in at least 6 years. She knew this because her father's rain gauge records and her own memory were both clear on it. In August, she noticed wet soil spreading outward from the creek bank well into the north pasture on both sides, ground that had been cracked and pale the August before. Grass was coming in along the margins, real grass, not the dry browse remnant that disappears by the first hot week. She turned off the water hauler at the end of July 2020. The stock tank at the north end was being fed by the rising water table, not by the creek directly, not by any pipe or intervention, just by the ground itself holding more water than it had in years. The tank wasn't full, but it was enough. She called Walt Tibbs that week and left him a voicemail. She didn't say she'd told him so. She just said the tank was back up, and she thought he might want to come see what the creek looked like. She said it in a way that was neither triumphant nor apologetic, because she hadn't been arguing with him in the first place. He came out on the 11th of August and walked the creek with her without saying much for the better part of an hour. He looked at the pools. He looked at the willows, the ones Dale Mercer had walked past and called dying, which were not dying anymore. Several had leafed back out from the root crown, which is what willows do when the soil water table rises back up to meet them. They don't recover fast, but they recover. Walt Tibbs stood at the second dam for a while and looked at it. He asked how the pair had found that location, and she explained about the check dams she'd built and how the initial ponding had attracted them to that bend. He asked her a few questions about the permit process, whether it was complicated, whether it took a long time. She told him it wasn't, once you found the right contact at ADFW. He thanked her and drove back to his place. He called Maggie Holt 6 weeks later. Dale Mercer from the Conservation District came back out in the fall of 2021 at her invitation. She hadn't invited him to prove anything. She'd invited him because he had 22 years of experience, and she thought his read on what was happening would be worth having. He walked the full creek corridor with her. He had brought a younger colleague, a woman a few years out of graduate school, who had done her thesis on process-based restoration in arid systems. The colleague asked good questions. Mercer took notes. At the end of the walk, standing at the truck in the last of the afternoon light, he told Nora that the results were better than he would have predicted for a site this far into degradation. He said it clearly and without hedging, like a man being honest about something that cost him something to say. She appreciated that. She told him so. She runs a pair of properties now, the original 1,840 acres and a 640-acre parcel she leased in 2022. Partly because the lease was priced right, and partly because it had a degraded creek draw she thought was a good candidate for the same treatment. She is 39. There are 3 active beaver families on the original property. One introduced pair on the leased ground that built their first dam in 9 days, which Ryan told her was faster than average when she called him to report it. The stock tank on the north pasture has not gone dry since July 2020. She still hauls water to one section of the south pasture during the worst of August, but it is one short run now, not 5 days a week. She figures she saves somewhere in the range of $8,500 to $10,000 a year in water-related costs compared to 2019, though she says she's never sat down and done the full accounting in one clean pass, and she doesn't want to overstate it. She is 39. She still has the folder her father kept. She added to it more articles, photographs she took herself over 3 summers, a printout of a study from a university in Montana on hyperheic zone restoration in semi-arid riparian corridors. She put a handwritten sticky note on the front of the folder. It says, he was right. Not revenge, exactly. Not even vindication, just the feeling of a thing that was always true finally being proven out in the ground, and the water and the grass you can walk through in August and feel damp under your boots where it used to be cracked and white. Jerry Voss wrote to the state twice about beavers and got 2 polite letters back saying the program wasn't running in his district. He spent 40 years watching his creek get thinner and shorter every decade. He kept the articles anyway. read them again. He wrote notes in the margins. He believed the right answer was somewhere in those papers, even when nobody would act on it, and so he left the folder where his daughter would find it, in a filing cabinet in the shop, under a label he wrote in his own handwriting, where it sat for 3 years after his death, until she pulled open the drawer in January looking for something else entirely. He didn't know if it would ever amount to anything. He just felt like he ought to write it down. That is what patience looks like. Not waiting around. Not giving up. Just keeping the knowledge alive until there was someone patient enough and stubborn enough to use it.